And I have two very special guests here, and I'm going to be talking to my immediate left. This is Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus on The Chosen. Hello.
Because God is going to save his sheep, period. And he uses evangelism to do that. So we can trust in God. We can trust that he's going to use us. We don't have to manufacture our own, our own gimmicks or our own really it's pragmatism.
Hear what you say. These signs are screaming at you, bro. Did you get a good shot?
And so you see it in the churches with seeker-friendly services, but you also see it in evangelism methods that are out there, so we don't have to do that.
Woo woo! Welcome to Bible Theory, homie.
Taking the church to the streets, homie.
Say what? Hey there, welcome back. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Bible Theory Podcast. I got a special guest. Coming back on the show is Pastor Ryan. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on and to talk about, on this season. Last season we talked about Augustine. So this season we're talking about Presbyterianism. We're breaking it down as much as we can. And today we're going to be talking about Presbyterians and evangelism and the topic of evangelism going back and forth. So but real quick, why don't you, for those who don't know you, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, my name's Ryan Denton. I live in Lubbock, Texas. So right now I oversee, I'm the organizing pastor for two church plants, one in Lubbock and then one an hour and a half west of here in Clovis, New Mexico. And we started the one in New Mexico about 2.5 years ago, the one in Lubbock about 1.5 years ago. By God's grace, both are we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of hungry young families primarily who are coming to the church, and we have some older wisdom as well in there, but just seeing what God is doing in the lives and in the families of younger people, it's quite amazing. I don't know, maybe some people might not call it a revival depending on your introduction or definition, I guess, but it's to me it's like you look across the country and this is pretty much widespread. These young families who are hungry for reformed and Presbyterian doctrine in churches, and they're coming in and they're catechizing their children. They're eager to share the gospel, to make Christ known in their workplace and in their family and in their neighborhoods. It's remarkable, man. I don't know what God is doing, but it seems like he's stirring people up and stirring young people up. And then also I've been open air preaching for a long time as well, and that's one of my certainly one of my more favorite, I don't know if I can say most favorite, but it's one of my more favorable ministries, going out on the streets, campuses, downtowns, preaching the gospel. I also, do jail ministry, homeless shelter type of ministry, bus station ministry, that type. So I'm more of an evangelist than a pastor. I'm certainly, even in these church plants, the idea is not for me to settle in and pastor here long term, but rather to continue serving the churches as an evangelist and by God's grace go and plant more churches, which seems a little daunting, to be honest. Just two right now is it's a lot, and it's a blessed work, man. It's a good work. We do have some interest in other parts in West Texas as far as church plants go. So it's exciting. It's cool because I know what's neat is that I feel like I'm humbled regularly by just different things and how the Lord keeps us aware that this is his work. It's not, we can't do it without him. I recognize, man, as far as my own self goes, just how insufficient I am. And so to see God move, even despite our weaknesses and, some of our, not just weaknesses, but even our lack of gifting in certain ways, how he moves. And so I've seen that a lot here. I have 3 small young boys. And so we have one that just turned 2. We have another that's 4, and another son was born about 1.5 months ago. So it's been crazy, but I've appreciated, I just realized I've talked for 4 minutes straight. I do want to say I've appreciated the series that you're doing on Presbyterian topics. So to bring in evangelism on that topic, I think, man, this is spot on, and it's needed and it's important. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. I love your work. I've seen a couple of your videos, your interactions with college students, and it's pretty amazing. It proves total depravity. If you don't like total depravity, I get it, but just go out there and start preaching, and you'll become convinced of total depravity pretty quickly.
I had a buddy in El Paso. He said that he was in our Arminian until he started evangelizing on a regular basis. And now he's, full blown Calvinist. So
yeah, just go out there and just go out there and start talking to people. You're going to encounter some weird philosophy, some crazy philosophy,
anger and all that. Yeah.
Anger and depression. Yes. So, why don't you give us an introduction on the tenets, the major tenets of Reformed evangelism? If you can, just take us to a 30-foot elevation view of what is Reformed evangelism.
When you go about evangelizing and you start looking into, like, let's say, literature on evangelism, and this is something that came to my mind when I was writing some of the books that I wrote on this topic. That's why I wrote, I always was like, man, I'm never going to write anything. But, when you start realizing there's not a whole lot on Reformed evangelism, there's a void out there. There needs to be something out there. And that's why I took up the pen on this topic, because there is a difference between Reformed evangelism and Arminian evangelism. When you read most books out there, in a very, like you mentioned, 30 seconds or a minute, the best way to summarize the difference between Reformed and, let's say, a non-Reformed evangelism is, okay, first of all, I can't convert anybody. That's the idea of, the presupposition of Reformed evangelism is God's the one that saves, and he uses means to do it. Whenever you're talking to an Arminian, they would agree with that, by and large. Okay, God's the one who saves and he uses means to do it, but there's also that wiggle room where it says, okay, but there's also the part that you have to play when it comes to, let's say, your conversion. And that's why when you read accounts of Arminians, whenever they describe evangelism, a lot of times they define it in terms of results, so in other words, I've read book after book of very well-known Arminian guys who write on evangelism and church planting. And they'll say if there are no conversions, it doesn't qualify as evangelism, which in my mind is insane. So you look at what the scriptures teach, salvation is of the Lord. Like we just mentioned, they're depraved, they're not seeking God. And so if that's the nature of things, that, there's nothing we can do to save these guys. So Reformed evangelism is about acknowledging that God has sheep out there and he's going to bring those sheep in, but he uses means to do that. And that's why the whole idea that Calvinists don't evangelize or, they shouldn't evangelize, that's nonsense, because God very clearly uses means. He doesn't write the gospel on tea leaves, or in the sky. He calls us to go out. How will they hear without a preacher? How will they preach unless they're sent? Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God, that kind of thing. So Reformed evangelism is much more optimistic and confident because God is going to save his sheep, period. And he uses evangelism to do that. So we can trust in God. We can trust that he's going to use us. We don't have to manufacture our own gimmicks or our own really it's pragmatism. And so you see it in the churches with seeker-friendly services, but you also see it in evangelism that are out there, so we don't have to do that. God's given us a gospel. He's given us the name of Christ. Go out there, share Christ with people. And through that, he's going to save people.
Actually, it was funny. This weekend, I had someone come and knock on my door, and they gave me and my family a box of food. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Thank you. And they invited me and my family to a crusade tent meeting. And I was like, oh, man, no, I'm good, man. I'm good. And then I looked in the food box and was like, dude, there's nothing good in here to eat. Like a bag of Lay's and like some pasta shells. I was like, bro, like that's not attractive, bro. Like coming over here, bringing me a box of, I threw it in the trash. I was like, I can't eat this stuff. But and plus I looked at the flyer and it was like a tent meeting crusade. And he's like, Jesus works until now. Come and see the proof. And I was like, oh my goodness.
And that's where the pragmatism comes in, like it's like, okay, from a Reformed perspective, think of this, right? So I'm going to the Chicano Knox's house and I'm going to knock on the door, and let's assume I don't know that you're converted, right? Well, here's the thing. So am I going to think, okay, what is it that's going to save this guy? Well, okay, from the Reformed perspective, what saves the guy is the gospel. From their perspective, what saves the person is, okay, you've got to make it appealing enough or attractive enough or pretty enough or how emotional enough, however you want to describe it. Because there's all different ways, that's what actually saves people from their perspective, and so it's just like, man, and it all comes back to theology. That's why, people, evangelism, just like any other thing, proper evangelism is driven by right theology, period. And man, we're seeing the fruit of really bad theology when it comes to when you go out and you see what's going on with evangelism and church services, seeker-friendly church services, and then you're talking to people about, I'm over in Texas, everybody claims to be a Christian, and you're like, okay, well, they're not. So even when it comes to that, like, how did you come about thinking that you were actually a Christian? Like, who told you that? And they'll tell you, well, so-and-so told me that, or I did this, or I did that. And, we all know the stories about all the stuff that goes on in churches or what people are saying. So it all comes down to theology, though. That's why it's so
throwing the pine cone in the fire.
Yeah. Hey, man. And,
So you mentioned, there's different forms, and I think we already mentioned some of it, like a random stranger coming up and giving you a horrible sample of a box of food. And you know what I mean? So like, what are other forms that are totally different forms of evangelism that are out there, popular, that are pragmatic, that are not reformed?
You're gonna get me in trouble here, Chicano Knox, man. You know why, dude? I've never. You talk about just smacking a hornet's nest with a baseball bat. Nothing does it like criticizing Ray Comfort's tracks, but to me, and even his approach, I mean, look, I'll be the first to admit Ray Comfort has, I mean, there's a lot of fruit from his ministry. So I don't want to just knock the whole thing, and I think Ray Comfort is a brother in the Lord and everything else. But from my own personal experience a long time ago and to this day, when you see it, to me, that is a very good example of something that is a very popular method of evangelism. If the listeners don't know what I'm talking about, I'm talking like the money tracks, like, here's $1 million bill. And you're like, oh, sweet. Now their argument is, well, they don't really think it's $1 million. But I've been at bus stations before when people receive like $1 million tract or even like downtown somewhere, and they think they don't know, right? And they think, hey, man, and then there's that millisecond or second where you actually think it's real money, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's a gospel tract. What's up with that? Like, why do you why you? And the same thing even with, and again, this is not to knock Ray Comfort. He presents the gospel when he gets to it, in a good way. There's some Arminian stuff, but all overall, right? I mean, Ray Comfort's gospel, it's not like it's a false gospel. I mean, he does present it, but in order to get to the gospel, there's a lot of bait and switch. There's a lot of pragmatism going on. So, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm not knocking Ray Comfort. I'm saying, well, to the extent that method is being used, yes. You know what I'm saying? So I think that is a good example. I mean, it happens a lot. Like at the college ministries, when you go to like a college campus, you see different types of ministries that are out there. And, there's a lot of lollipop and coffee type of evangelism going on. But lollipop. That's how it is, man. They're handing out suckers, and they're like, hey. And you go and you're like, okay, well, where's the gospel tracts though? Where's the Bibles? At least the $1 million bills, at least they have some gospel on the back, So, but it's just to say, man, there's so much out there, and I think it's driven by bad theology. It is, and so on the flip side for us, it's not to say, and I want to point this out too. It's not to say that you can't, let's say, have a pizza party where you have the gospel that's going to be shared or something like that. It's not to say you can't do that. It's not to say that you can't hand out suckers, right? But it's to say that if all you're doing is handing out suckers, or if you're gathering people through gimmicks and through pragmatism, rather than just trusting in the sovereignty of God, that He is sovereign and He has given us the means by which people get saved, namely the gospel, and proclaiming it, or handing out gospel tracts, people encountering the gospel. If you're relying on anything besides that, then at what point do we look at it and we say, okay, there's a lack of trust here. There's a lack of faith that we have in God and in His prescribed means when it comes to evangelism. And you see it a lot. So there's some gray area, because again, it's not to say that you can't be creative, but it's to say what is driving the creativity. And a lot of times it's the idea that, well, I have to be creative enough in order to make the gospel presentable or attractive. And that's not the gospel.
Yes. In terms of the tactics, in terms of the approach, right? Because obviously, like you said, Ray Comfort does preach the gospel. He does get to it. Obviously, there's Armenian type stuff in there, but like, if you put that aside for a second, and he does kind of just give you the gospel, like, hey, you're not a good person, right? That's his whole catch. It's like, you're not a good person. You know what I mean?
Which, hey man, I'll be the first dude. I use that all the time, and that's so effective.
And that's great. But like what you're saying is so true. Like, we don't see major gimmicks or like prompts or some kind of bait and switches in the book of Acts. Like, you see Peter, you see Paul going over there, you know what I mean? Just preaching the gospel. You know, you don't see Paul going up there and be like, here's a $1 million bill that has Caesar's face on it. Yeah. Oh wait, it's the gospel. Yeah. He doesn't do that.
Hey, that's why there's riots breaking out. That's why he's getting stoned. You know, that's why people are upset, because that's what the gospel does. And so these other approaches, I feel like they try to neutralize the offensiveness of the cross. We don't have to be obnoxious about it, you know, but it's to say, like, you go out and you proclaim the gospel. Yeah, there is a reaction. People either think it's from God and they follow and they believe, or they think it's foolish, like it says in 1 Corinthians, and they don't believe, and they think you're a moron for proclaiming it. And so, you know, why try to neutralize that scandal or that offense? Just go out and proclaim it, because God is sovereign.
Presbyterians as well, we come from a rich heritage. The Reformed faith comes from a rich heritage of evangelism. You know, you think about George Whitefield, you think about, Jonathan Edwards, you think about Calvin and his love for reaching the lost. Like, the Institutes is basically like a gospel tract, right? When you think about that and how far we've come from that, I feel like we're Presbyterians are not. It's kind of like the Chicago Bulls, man. Like, in the 90s, they were all that, man. They ruled and dominated the 90s, except for a couple years, all right? But after that, they kind of fallen off. Like, when's the last time you heard the Chicago Bulls, you know what I mean, being taken seriously, right? It's kind of like that. Like, the Presbyterians are kind of like the Chicago Bulls. We had our heyday. We had our Michael Jordansons and like Scottie Pippens. And then once they were gone, for the most part, in terms of name brand and marketing and like name, you know what I mean? Name recognition, we're not there no more. I mean, it feels like another team is there. Obviously, the Armenians are right there, but like the Presbyterians is not shining right now. And there's a lot of knock and criticism to Presbyterians, whether it be the OPC guys, the PCA guys, you name it. Everybody, there's enough blame to go around. So if you're not a Presbyterian, if you're listening and you're like, yo, what about you guys? Well, like, I'm not saying that we're golden child anymore, man. Like, we have a lot of blame on ourselves too. You know what I mean? Even the non-Presbyterian, the Reformed Dutch guys, the Reformed German guys, they have a lot of blame to go around there too. So it's like, what's going on with the Presbyterians and evangelism? How are they doing? How have they done since George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards left the game?
Yeah, even before that, like you said, man. So you have Knox, you have Knox's guy Wishart, you have Calvin, but you also have the guy that recruits Calvin to Geneva, Farrell. These guys are open air preaching a lot. They're preaching wherever they can. Calvin's sending missionaries. He's doing a lot. He's training up guys to go and plant churches in France. These guys go to France. Most of them are slaughtered right away. Eventually, there's revival. But yeah, so and of course in Scotland, there's an outbreak of revival that sweeps through there in the 1500s. 1600s. But my point in that, and I know that as you said, so the engine is there when it comes to the mechanisms for evangelism and for vigorous and robust evangelism. Like, that is driven by the Reformed faith, by the Reformed doctrines. The fact that God is sovereign, that God has his sheep that will hear his voice, that will be converted, and he sends us to go get them and to call them out, to call them to Christ. The thing is when you look at today, okay, so I feel like when you talk to charismatic, for instance, let's take jail ministry. All right. You go into jail ministry. That was the first ministry I was ever part of. And I mean, it's still, to me, it's probably, I mentioned earlier, open air preaching. Jail ministry is probably my favorite ministry, even over open air preaching, because, you go in there, it's refreshing. These guys, there might be a lot of false conversions. Maybe there's a lot of, jailhouse conversion type of stuff. But, the reality is this, man, they are appreciative when you go in there and you preach the word and you teach them the word, right? You don't get that a lot when you go go to the streets, at least in America. Here's the thing, though. When you go into jails, who is in there doing jail ministry? Charismatics, Arminians, T.D. Jakes guys. Like you have all these kinds of, Church of Christ, Roman Catholic. But what you rarely see are Presbyterians.
It's true, man.
Right? I mean, you just don't. And my question is like, okay, or even like, let's say homeless shelters, right? And so the thing is it doesn't match. You mentioned Whitfield. Like Whitfield was going to the guys working in the coal mines. He's going to the jails. He's going to the slaves. He's going to, all the people that have been overlooked by the high Anglican church. They're going to these guys and they're preaching the gospel to them. And so you look at the Presbyterian church today, and it's very much like that high Anglican environment that Whitfield and Wesley were a part of in the 18th century. In the sense of the orthodoxy, sure, they have right theology, better theology than the Anglicans in the 18th century, by and large. But so we have right theology, we have the proper doctrines, we have proper orthodoxy by and large, right? We're teaching it. We have men that are properly ordained and properly, they've spent forever in seminary, and it's like, okay, so we have all of that. But when it comes to, you go inside the churches, why is it that, you don't see any, I mean, hardly any new converts. You don't see any people off the streets. You don't see any people, that by and large, right? I mean, I know this is like a gross generalization, but there is something to this. Whereas you go to charismatics don't have any problems going out to the streets and preaching to people and telling people about the Lord, and just doing whatever it takes. And so, it goes back to the gimmicks. I was knocking the Arminians for their poor theology and the gimmick, but here's the thing: they're doing it. At least they're out there. At least they're doing their thing. At least Ray Comfort's doing his thing. So it's like, okay, right, man. So I mean, that's a huge concern. And like you said, I mean, okay, when you look at even church growth and everything, yeah, you can try to grow a church in a very unbiblical way, in a pragmatic way, and you can do it. You can build a big church based on just like primarily very gimmick based kind of purpose-driven life type of things and messages and all that.
Just put a pride flag and everybody will come in.
Well, and so you can do it that way, right? And so here's the thing. So as Presbyterians, we look at that and we're like, man, we would never do that. We're never going to grow the church. We're never going to use these gimmicks and these pragmatic methods for doing this, right? But we also neglect the things that God has given us, that he has told us to do. And so, but as far as why that is, that's the bigger question. Why? I don't know, man. We could get into that a little too. Why?
Tell me, man. I'm interested. Like, why? Charles Finney was a Presbyterian, bro.
He was.
Let's get into it.
That's true, man. Charles Finney.
A lot of people don't know that. They're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, bro, look it up.
Yeah. No, so same thing with I think it's the Disciples of Christ, the guys that are kind of like a Church of Christ split off or something like that in the the 19th century. But yeah, but okay, so thankfully Finney, he starts doing his thing. But here's the Presbyterian that we forget about, is a guy like Samuel Davies, a guy like, let's say, I think he was at least they weren't, Asahel Nettleton's another guy. I don't know if I think he was a Congregationalist, but he was a Paedo-Baptist Congregationalist type, so, but the thing is, like, there are Reformed guys, okay? So they might, they might not be Presbyterian in the strict sense of the word, but they're Reformed. They're Reformed in their doctrines, and they, around the time of Finney, there's also a big movement of those guys going around and evangelizing, and they're calling Finney out for his gimmicks and for his pragmatism, for doing these things, these methods that he's basically inventing on the fly. So they're calling him out, but at the same time, it's not like they're doing that a lot of times from within the church. These guys are also going out, sharing the gospel, planting churches, evangelizing. And I know Presbyterians do that. Presbyterians do plant churches, and they evangelize. I mean, you and I both know plenty of Presbyterians that are doing that. But as you mentioned, It's not the culture. It's not the culture. And that's what I'm saying. Okay, that's our deficit. Because if you look at Calvin, if you look at Knox, if you look at what's going on there, their culture was spreading the gospel, advancing the kingdom, planting churches. That it wasn't like that was their second or third focus. That was a huge impetus of what they were doing. So we need to get back to that.
Some Christians will actually come back and be like, what? Many Reformed Christians would come back and say, I don't evangelize because not every Christian is called to be an evangelist or to go out there and share and be a witness. What do you have to say to that kind of attitude and that type of dilemma?
I think it's a cop out. If you try, I've heard people try to make the argument from Matthew 28 that was just an apostolic commission, and that's
Right.
not.
So you have like the full preterists who are
Yeah.
saying, no, we don't do that. And then you have, the Christians who are just like, well, that's just not my gift,
I mean, evangelism isn't like one of the gifts. We're all called to evangelize. When you look at the early church, when you look to see what's going on in the early church, I think there was a guy, Michael Green, that mentioned this in one of his books. And in fact, I got another guy. No, it's right here, actually. It's McMullen. Ramsey McMullen. His first name is Ramsey. Ramsey McMullen, Christianizing the Roman Empire. He's got a few of these books. And so, I mean, this guy's secular, but Michael Green is, he's a Christian. So you get like, when you read people who are reading and looking at what's going on in the early church, the church spreads by and large primarily not through, let's say, people like Paul per se, or not like even people like Irenaeus or Tertullian or some of these other guys that we look at, right? It's not to say they weren't important. They were equipping people, though. The church is spreading through ordinary lay persons going out into their everyday environments and sharing the gospel with people in their families and in their neighborhoods and in their places of work. And by God's grace, he moves on them and they're converted and they come in and they start coming into the church. That's how the church expand, and then other people by God's grace going and they're planting churches, and that same thing is being reproduced. So, I mean, the reality is if it's not for ordinary, everyday laypersons going out and evangelizing, it's not to say that the church isn't going to make it, because Christ is going to build his church, but it is to say that is how Christ builds his church, through ordinary laypersons going out and evangelizing. That's how I personally would read Ephesians 4, as far as when God, and I know there's some debate. I mean, I haven't heard. I mean, yeah, there's debate on every passage. When you get down in the nitty gritty, man, there's always Reformed Presbyterians, Reformed Baptists. We're always going, and that's good too. We're sharpening iron when we go and we look at this. When I look at Ephesians 4, where I'm saying, okay, when you're saying, okay, he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers and here's the thing, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. I think that's an accurate translation. I see the apostles and prophets being extraordinary offices, meaning they've ceased with the apostles. They in the first century. You see this in Ephesians 2. Actually, in Ephesians 2, they're foundational offices, but in Ephesians 2, it mentions apostles and prophets as foundational, not evangelists. So I believe that you still have the evangelists, and you have pastors and teachers. Well, it tells us right here, what are they for? Well, they're for building up the body of Christ, equipping the saints for the work of ministry, right? So in other words, pastors and teachers, what are they for? Well, they're to equip the saints. Well, the saints, it's not like, okay, well, I'm not called to be a pastor or teacher, so I can't teach my children anything about the Bible. Well, that's not true, right? Same thing with evangelism. Well, I'm not an evangelist, so I'm not called to evangelize my neighbor. That's simply not true. Evangelist in the little e sense of the word, teacher in the little t sense of the word, we're all called to do that. So, I mean, people try to get around the duty to evangelize, but at the end of the day, I mean, exegetically, I don't see it. Historically, you certainly don't see that. Pragmatically, put it this way, practically, I don't say pragmatically, but practically, as far as the outworking of how the church grows and expands, you don't see that, right? So it's a strange argument, but it's out there. So it's a good question to ask.
Okay, so back to the second Great Awakening. First of all, I don't know why they call it, Great and Awakening. I don't know. So, but anyways, how has in your studies, how has the second Great Awakening legacy, still with us today? Like how is it still surviving? Why is it still like thriving?
So, I mean, there's a few strands here from the second Great Awakening. Mainly negative strands, I would say. So, in the churches today, you still have like invitations, altar calls. That's from second Great Awakening. You have, even I was just reading earlier today, actually, ironically, basically a breakdown in how even music in churches are viewed. So now music in most churches are seen as something that is to draw the person to God, something that's to move the person to it. It's very man-centered. It's about what can the music elicit in you in a way that brings you to to God or in a way that does something in you, you know, whereas I would say biblically, properly, music is about not us, but about what we give to God, not what happens to us, but us eliciting praise to God in response and adoration to God. So even things like that. But, you know, mainly I think probably the best way to describe it is something like emotionalism, pragmatism. And again, I mean, those are the negative aspects of it. And why won't it die? I think it's because look at the theology. You know, there's no theology in most churches by and large that would actually drive that kind of stuff out. Like that stuff's justified in a lot of ways because, you know, the means justify the ends. For, you know, a pragmatic type of church where you have to be the one who draws the people because you're an Arminian. You have to be the one who does this. If that's the way you see things, then yeah. Hey, bring in all the, you know, bring in the fireworks, bring in the light shows, bring in the fancy music, you know, make sure the pastor's sitting on a bar stool instead of preaching from a pulpit because that makes people happier and, or, you know, at least less intimidated. So they're drawn in. So in other words, you know, like once you throw out theology, anything goes, man. Once you have a man-centered theology, anything goes. And so, I mean, it's not going to be driven out until the church is more robust in its theology. But here's the thing, okay, how does that happen? Think of it this way, and this is, I don't think this is too much of a rabbit trail because it's on this topic. Okay, because my question is, okay, how does that change? Your question is, okay, how do you get rid of it? Right? How do you get back to a healthier direction? Well, it happens by Presbyterians going out and evangelizing. Because when we evangelize, let's say we match the charismatics in their evangelism efforts. Let's say we do that, right? And let's say that is our modus operandus, that we're out there doing this. This is what we're going to do. Well, what happens is people are going to get converted. People are drawn in. And so then, although, yeah, they have Arminian baggage, although they have like rapture garbage theology, they have Arminian theology, they have all this, you know, weird theology, right? Well, what happens is as they're being discipled by us, as they're being trained up by us, then there's a shift that's going to take place in the Christian culture as far as the Christian church goes, right? And the world at large. Because right now, if you look, by and large, I mean, what are most Christians? Well, they're Arminians, right? They're seeker friendly. They're very pragmatic. They're driven by the Second Great Awakening as far as the negative side effects of that. They're driven by that, and they don't know that. And by and large, they don't know that, right? So Our job is to come alongside of them and disciple them, make new converts of lost people, bring them in, train them up, disciple them in the Reformed Presbyterian faith, in the Reformed Presbyterian doctrine, and basically it'll take a lot of time. You know, unless God moves, and He can, and He has, like you mentioned, the Second Great Awakening. I mean, there could be here. Let me add this with the awakenings. When you look at the cultures that Wesley was in, and Whitefield was in, and all these guys, the culture at that time was horrific as far as the evil, the rampant wickedness, the darkness in those cultures, deism, skepticism, all these things, atheism, and then all of a sudden God moves, and there is revival, and there is an awakening. That's the First Great Awakening, and it happens again towards the end of the 18th century, you know, when the Second Great Awakening begins. Ian Murray's got a great book on that, Revival and Revivalism. There's a revival, genuine outpouring of God's Spirit, but then eventually, yes, it is hijacked. There's a counterfeit movement as well. That's revivalism. But man, if you look at our culture today, it's like, yeah, God has poured out His Spirit. Look at the Reformation. What else is that other than, you know, that is a great awakening in a sense. That is a revival, you know, so, and that was a very dark era in the church. So God can move. I think we are in a dark era of the church as far as its theology and its practice, but God can move, and He has done it before. And so we need to be praying for that and expecting, you know, hey, God's going to move on His people, on His church, and on Presbyterians. We're going to go out and we're going to see Christ glorified and magnified in this Christian culture that we're in.
Very optimistic.
Hey, that is optimistic, man. Yeah.
You know, some Christians will come back and be like, you know what? Presbyterians are really good at being winsome right now. It seems like there's a movement within Presbyterians to be winsome, not offensive. You know, the Keller people, the Keller circles of Presbyterians will say, you know what, we don't want to be offensive. We need to be winsome. We need to be modern. We still are somehow reformed, somehow robust and smart, engaging, but like at the same time, we're winsome. And we are winning people, not converting them or whatever it is. You know, they're really good with words. So What is wrong with Presbyterians and their fascinations or intoxication with winsome?
Yeah. All right. So when I think it was the second book I wrote, Even If None, and this was before it was cool to call out winsomeness. But there's a section in that book, and I was a Reformed Baptist at the time, so maybe that's maybe that's why. I mean, but I tried to take a respectful critique of that, because, and it's tricky because, it's not to say that we should not be respectful. It's not to say we should not be patient and gentle and long suffering with those that we're engaging, with the gospel, no matter what. So it's not to say that, but it is to say the problem that I saw and that I see even more so now that I've crossed the Tiber is the desire is, okay, it is to be winsome. Right. Okay. So we want to be nice and respectful and everything, but I feel like, and I could be wrong. I mean, so it's impossible to really look at people's motives as far as what is behind that, what's driving that. But to me, does seem to be driven by a desire not to be offensive, not to be a scandal. It's a desire to be respectable. It's a desire to be seen as intellectual. It's a desire to be seen as somebody who is well polished and part of the intellectual class that knows what they're talking about. And yeah, granted, I mean, some people are like that naturally, right? I mean, they're just that way. But the thing, and so there's nothing wrong with it on the surface, and even underneath, there's nothing wrong with, okay, you have a guy that's like, let's say he's a professor or something, and he is smart, right? He's got a PhD or whatever, and that's who he is, right? But at the same time, I feel like people go out of their way to do that and to be that. And again, you go back to, let's look at like Paul and Jesus. He has a bunch of fishermen and they're rough and tumble, and Jesus himself is a scandal. And John the Baptist, he makes a point that he's not he's not in fine clothing, and he's not like this elite superstar guy. And so to me, it's antithetical to the nature of what the cross is and to what the reproach of the cross is about. So again, it's not to say that we shouldn't be gentle and respectful and patient and kind and meek and everything, but it's to say that, okay, I feel like Presbyterians oftentimes go way overboard. It becomes superficial. It's kind of like, what it's like? It's like, when you're, I remember when I was first converted and even before that, my idea of Christianity was people that have like a very fake happiness all the time, they're just going around. They're like too bubbly. They're too over the top with their niceness almost. And it's like that in a more polished sense. It's like, okay. I don't know. So it's that's why it's tricky. It's tricky to like nail down what exactly is wrong with it. Because if winsome means nice, respectful, respectable, gentle, meek, and all that, okay, well, there's no problem. But the problem is why don't we call it nice or meek or respectable instead of winsome? Like, why? That's another thing. Why use the term winsome? That's not a Bible term. Why not use meek? Why not? Hey, we need to be meek. We need to be gentle. We need to be respectful. But no, we need to be winsome. What is winsome? In fact, I looked it up, man. I don't know if attractive or appealing in appearance or character. That's the definition right off the top. I mean, so again, it's like, I don't know, man. I mean, I can't see Paul, really making sure that everything is winsome, all the time.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
And that might just be like a pet peeve, a hobby horse. But yeah, I don't know if you even knew that that was a pet peeve for me. But you definitely.
I know, man. What is presuppositional evangelism? If you could just give it to us, and then like, what is evidential-based evangelism, and which one's better? I guess just to put it in MMA terms, like which one's better? Yeah,
well, presup is definitely better because it's a more robust, more overtly. That's a better way to say it. More overtly reformed approach to apologetics. Like if you read Van Til, though, Van Til is not opposed to evidence. He's not opposed to providing evidential-based arguments. The problem is whenever you're using that as what's driving your apologetics, as far as my reading of Van Til and some of the other guys that kind of come from Van Til. But yeah, so presuppositional apologetics, man, is one of the maybe two or three things for me that was absolutely just a huge game changer in my ministry and my evangelism, because I'd been doing the evidence stuff for probably 8 years when I came across some videos on presuppositional apologetics, and it just rocked my world, especially the idea of Romans 1 that, because, okay, so evidential based arguments is okay. So I have to give you probable cause for why it is that God exists. And then I need you to commit to that at least admit that, okay, it's probably the case that God exists. And once you get there, you're like, okay, now I'm going to give you probable cause that not only does God exist, but that God is a triune God, that there's three persons. Or sometimes they go to like the Bible comes from God or the virgin birth or whatever. And so it's like piecemeal. Whereas presuppositional is the whole package. You can't dismiss, when you talk about God, you can't have a generic abstract God that then leads to a Trinitarian God. It's a Trinitarian God from the beginning. And that Trinitarian God, because of who he is, it presupposes that, okay, the virgin birth, creation from nothing, the iron axe floating in water, the parting of the Red Sea, right? Whatever it is, it all comes in together with the fact that's who God is. And so evidential is more about piecemealing it and breaking it down. And then even then it's like, okay, and it depends on who you're talking to, like a William Lane Craig guy, it's more about, well, probable or reasonable that God exists. Well, Romans 1 says that no, God does exist and everyone knows that. And so they're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. Once I found that out, man, it's a game changer as far as how you deal, especially in our culture with atheists, agnostics, skeptics, you name it. If they're of the stripe that's like, well, I don't know if I haven't quite figured out if God exists or not or whatever, like an agnostic, you're like, listen, man, I have here from God's own lips, from the testimony of God that he exists. So what's going on? Like what is it that's causing you to suppress it? Well, the Bible tells us that too. Unrighteousness. Sin. So yeah, that's a game changer, man. And there's obviously, whole 2 or 3 year courses on this topic alone. So it's hard to get into everything, but yeah, it's a game changer in evangelism to me.
Okay, so here's some applications to bring this to a close. How we ought to evangelize then. You talked about some of the landmines and some of the ditches. So how we ought to evangelize them.
Well, the thing is if it centers around the gospel, if that's what we're out, if that's what it is, it doesn't matter if you're door knocking, if you're talking to a guy at work, if you're talking to somebody on the phone, telemarketer, your mother, you see your neighbor on the street, in other words, open air preaching, going into jails, to me, it's so multifaceted, man. Evangelism to me is so simple, but not to me like, it's not, here's the thing. It's simple, but it's probably one of the hardest things to do because of our flesh, So, and I think that's why people they try to make it more attractive. Because if it's attractive, when I share the gospel with somebody, it's not going to be as uncomfortable. Evangelism is uncomfortable, man. I've been evangelizing for about 10 years very consistently. And I can't say that I enjoy it, but it's a challenge. It's a struggle with the flesh. And there are so many times when I'm faithless in this, where I'm like, man, I know I need to give this person a gospel track and I chicken out. Or I know I need to tell them about Jesus and I chicken out straight up. And it's like, okay, well, why is that? Well, it's because of my flesh, because I love myself. I love my pride. I don't want to be seen as this or that. And so going back to your question, how do you evangelize? You tell people about the gospel. That's it. It's like, dude, you can do it in the open air. You can do it on the phone. You can do it on Facebook. You can do it on an email. I know a guy that he'd get these envelopes with things in it, the kind that are prepaid envelopes, and they want you to send something back. He'll drop a gospel track in there, lick it, put it in the mailbox, and off it goes. Like you can there's all kinds of ways to do it, but what we hate doing, and what I know by experience, the reason we hate it is because we're afraid, dude. It's hard, but that's not an excuse. That's sinful on our part. So yeah, again, looking at all the methods that are out there, it's like, hey, it's very simple. So why do we create extra barriers to the gospel, extra noise, instead of just, hey, here's the gospel, take it or leave it. Come to Christ, here it is, and let the chips fall where they may.
Man, praise God for that. It's so liberating. What What is your closing thoughts? Do you have any closing thoughts? Any highlights you want to stress before we end it?
I'm so encouraged, man, by there are Presbyterians out there who are doing the work, and I don't want to make light of that, because there's a movement, man. I don't know, whatever it is, like, guys, even in open air preaching, when I first started open air preaching, I was there were other guys doing it before me, and I reached out to these guys, and they'd already been doing it for like 10 years, 15 years. A lot of these guys kind of showed me the ropes and helped me. But, as I became more familiar with this, and it is almost like a subculture in the Christian world, I guess. But, what amazes me is that the amount of Reformed interest for open air preaching, and I'm bringing open air preaching up because that's a pretty weird ministry if you think of it, like to actually go out to where all the people are and just to start preaching. And there's ways to do it, and that one of the books that I wrote with Scott Smith on open air preaching, the one that RHB published, biblically speaking, we think that there are some reservations, not that just everybody should go out and start preaching, right? But it's to say, right, you have people in the Reformed world, a lot of people, not just like, there's 3 or 4 of us. There's a ton of us who are Reformed, who are Presbyterian, who are going out, and they have this interest to go out and to preach the gospel in the open air and to evangelize, even if they're not open air preaching, to evangelize people, to tell people about the gospel. Dude, the fact that you're having a podcast about Reformed evangelism, right? These are demonstrations that God is moving within the Reformed community when it comes to reaching the lost with the gospel. And that we need to be encouraged by that, and certainly keep praying for more of that. That God will continue raising more people up, more podcasts like this, more episodes like this, where the word is getting out, to be encouraged, to be faithful, to know that God is moving. That's what we need, man. And that's what God is doing within, I feel like, the whole Reformed community. So not a lot of people are aware of it, but it's there and it's growing, this hunger for evangelism.
Yes, I see that. I've witnessed that. I met many people out there who are either, on the parking lot of Reformed theology, like the Reformed Baptists, not just a little jab. But, many Presbyterians I have met who are out there, generating their own gospel tracts and buying gospel tracts, buying books, like giving out like Reformed literature. Like I've met people out there, doing things, and it's pretty impressive to see that going on outside of raising people from the dead on the streets and doing miracles. But
Ligonier, I just found out Ligonier has a whole section for prison ministry that they have. So they'll send resources and everything. So it's like stuff like that, man. It's, there's definitely a growing awareness. I don't think our problem is hyper Calvinism. At least, there is an awareness that we need to be doing this. And I think God is moving on us to do it. And so, there just needs to be a little more of the kick in the pants for us to actually, to be more fervent in this.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the kick in the pants is happening now. Let's go ahead and close it out. Leave it there. Thank you so much for tuning in, joining us. If you like it, go ahead and hit that like button, a little subscribe button as well. Don't forget to turn on the notifications to get notified for every interview. We got other things coming up. So stay tuned and God bless.